Assalamu alaikum. So there are different words for love in the Quran. So for example, there's the word mawaddah or wood, which is related to the verb wadda, and there's the word hubb. Now, why do we use different words for love in the Quran? So the Quran is very specific and meticulous in its wording. So in this video, we want to analyze why is the word for love different in different contexts. So for example, just to give a couple examples before we look into the specifics. So when we talk about love in relationship to Allah, we find a very interesting thing in the Quran. So the word hubb, Allah doesn't use it as a noun or a name for himself, but he uses it as a verb. So for example, he says yuhibbu, like yuhibbul muttaqin as a verb, that he loves al muttaqin, but he doesn't call himself as a name al muhib, the one that loves. However, we find the opposite with the word mawadda. He doesn't use it for himself as a verb. He doesn't say yawaddu, but he does use it for himself as a noun or a name. He calls himself wadud, the loving one. So why? What's the difference? Another example where it becomes really interesting is when Allah tells us about relationships and our mates. He says, وَمِنْ آيَاتِهِ أَنْ خَلَقَ لَكُم مِّنْ أَنفُسِكُمْ أَزْوَاجًا لِتَسْكُنُوا إِلَيْهَا. He says, and from his ayat, from his signs and lessons, is that he created for you from your own selves, azwajan, mates, litaskunu ilayha, so you can dwell with them in tranquility. وَجَعَلَ بَيْنَكُمْ مَوَدَّةً وَرَحْمَةً. And he made or placed between you mawaddatan wa rahma, love and mercy. But the word that he uses for love here is mawadda. He doesn't say وَجَعَلَ بَيْنَكُمْ حُبًّا وَرَحْمَةً. He doesn't use the word hubb. So why? What's the difference and how does that affect our understanding here of relationships? So love with regards to Allah and love with regards to relationships, we find some very interesting usages of the words mawadda and the word hubb, or variations of the word hubb. So let's look a little bit more specifically. I think one of the ways that we can start to unpack the differences between these two is to look at the opposites of each one. So in the Quran, each one of these has a different opposite, right? So if we look at the word hubb, for example, and we go to chapter 2, verse 216. So in chapter 2, verse 216, we see something very interesting. He says, كُتِبَ عَلَيْكُمُ الْقِتَالُ وَهُوَ كُرْهٌ لَكُمْ. That al-qital, fighting or struggling, is prescribed upon you, وَهُوَ كُرْهٌ لَكُمْ, while it is something disliked or hated to you. And we're going to talk about this word that's translated as disliked or hated a little bit more. Then he continues, وَعَسَى أَن تَكْرَهُ شَيْئًا وَهُوَ خَيْرٌ لَكُمْ. And it may be that you hate or dislike something while that thing is good for you. وَعَسَى أَن تُحِبُّ شَيْئًا. And it might be that you love, but he uses the word tuhibbu, which comes from hubb, or is related to hubb. It might be that you have hubb for something, وَهُوَ شَرٌ لَكُمْ, well, it's bad or evil for you. So beginning with this verse, we can see that the opposite of hubb is karaha or kurh. And the word karaha or kurh can be translated as to detest something, to dislike something, to find some disgust from something. So some kind of aversion. You feel averse to something. You feel repelled from something. So the opposite of that is hubb. So just from this verse, we can potentially start to unpack a definition that hubb has to do with being drawn towards something, because it's the opposite of karaha. Something that supports this definition is when we go to chapter 49. So when we go to chapter 49, Surah Al-Hujurat, and we go to verse 12, when he tells us about backbiting, he says, وَلَا يَغْتَبْ بَعْضُكُمْ بَعْضًا, and do not backbite one another. Then he says, أَيُحِبُّ, so he uses the word yuhibbu from hubb, أَيُحِبُّ أَحَدُكُمْ أَنْ يَأْكُلَ لَحْمَ أَخِيهِ مَيْتًا. Would one of you love to eat the flesh of his dead brother? فَكَرِهْتُمُوهُ, This is something that you would not love, so therefore فَكَرِهْتُمُوهُ, right? So this is something that you would find to be repulsive, repugnant, disgusting. He uses the word karaha. But see, the word karaha here, فَكَرِهْتُمُوهُ, right? Or kur, from the three-letter root, kaf, ra, and ha, here is in relationship to consuming the dead flesh of your brother, which is something by nature we would find repulsive. So this gives us a definition of karaha or kur, or any related word that has that three-letter root, having something to do with being averse to something, wanting to get away from something, finding something disgusting, which is the opposite here of hubb, ayuhibbu. So therefore that supports the idea that hubb is the opposite, which is to be drawn to something. Now, another verse that supports this definition or this way of thinking about hubb is in Surah Yusuf. So we go to chapter 12, Surah Yusuf, and we'll look at verse 8 and 9. So the brothers of Yusuf say here, إِذْ قَالُوا لَيُوسُفُ وَأَخُوهُ أَحَبُّ إِلَىٰ أَبِينَا مِنَّا وَنَحْنُ عُصْبَةٌ. When they said, surely Yusuf and his brother are more beloved, أَحَبُّ, to our father than us, وَنَحْنُ عُصْبَةٌ, well, we are a strong group. So their problem with Yusuf and his brother was what? That their father had more hubb, not mawaddah, hubb, ahabbu, right? Now, if you look at the next verse, when they started plotting to get Yusuf out of the way, look what they said. اقتلوا يوسف أو اطرحوه أرضا. Kill Yusuf or expel him to another land. يخلو لكم وجه أبيكم. They said, the face of your father, يخلو لكم, would be empty for you. The face of your father would be empty for you. Now, let's pay really close attention to the wording. In the previous verse, they said, ahabbu. He's more beloved. Yusuf and his brother are more beloved. Our father has more hubb. But when they plotted to get rid of Yusuf, right, what was their wording? It wasn't yakhlu lakum hubbu abikum. The love of your father would be solely for you, even though that's what they wanted. It was wajhu abikum. It was the face of your father. Why? And how do those relate? How does the idea of them seeking the hubb of their father relate to the wajh of their father? Because the wajh represents muwajaha. It represents what you face. So therefore, these two things overlap because you face towards what you love, right? So they wanted the love of their father that was given to Yusuf and his brother because they wanted their father perhaps to pay more attention, to face towards them, to direct his attention towards them. So from these three verses, we can start to get a beginning idea that the word hubb, potentially, because it's the opposite of kur or karaha, has to do with being drawn towards something. Now, let's look at some of the verses with mawaddah. What's the opposite of mawaddah? The opposite of mawaddah is not karaha or kur. The opposite of mawaddah or wud is adawa, is enmity or hostility. So if we go to chapter 60, verse 1, he says, Ya ayyuha alladhina amanu, la tattakhidhu aduwi wa aduwakum awliya'a tulquna ilayhim bil mawaddah. He says, O you who have believed, do not take my enemy and your enemy. So he uses the word adu from adawa, or related to adawa, hostility, enmity, right? Do not take my enemy and your enemy as awliya, as friends, supporters, helpers, protectors. Tulquna ilayhim bil mawadda, throwing to them, right? Al mawadda, not hub, mawadda, this kind of love. Okay? So it's the opposite. Mawadda here is the opposite of someone being an enemy. And what supports that in the same surah in verse 7, so chapter 60, verse 7, he says, Asallahu an yaj'ala baynakum wa bayna alladhina aadaytum minhum mawadda. Perhaps Allah would make between you and between those who you have enmity with, wa bayna alladhina aadaytum minhum mawadda. Perhaps Allah will make between you and between those who you have adawa with mawaddah, right? So mawaddah, if you have adawa and Allah changes that, right? And he makes something else between you and the one you had adawa with, that something else will be called mawaddah. Okay? Different type of love. So from these couple examples, we can start to think about and start to see some of the differences from the opposites. So hubb, the opposite is to be averse to something. So hubb is something you're drawn towards. And mawadda, the opposite of it is adawa. So mawadda has something to do with the absence of conflict and enmity and hostility and something of that nature. And we're going to unpack that more. Another way to think about wadda, mawadda, wood, all the words that revolve around that, is that it also contains the idea of wishing for something to come about. So if you look, for example, there's quite a few examples of this in the Qur'an. But if we just take this one example, which is chapter 2, verse 109. So if we go to chapter 2, verse 109, he says, wadda, so he uses the verbal form here, wadda kathirun min ahli al-kitabi law yaruddunakum min ba'di imanikum kuffaran. So if we just translated this, we would say, many of the people of the book wish that they could, that they could turn you back after having faith to being kuffar. Okay? So that many of the people of the book wish that they would turn you back after having faith to being kuffar. But what's the word that we're translating as wish here? Wadda. So you could say many of them love to, but I think sometimes we might translate this as wish because it has the idea. I looked up because a bug was flying. But I think it has the idea of wanting something to come about too, right? So this is another difference with the word wadda, that it has the idea in it of wanting something to come about. Another example for this is if we look at chapter 3, verse 69. So chapter 3, verse 69 says, وَدَّتْ طَائِفَةٌ مِّنْ أَهْلِ الْكِتَابِ لَوْ يُضِلُّونَكُمْ. A group of the people of the book wish that they could lead you astray. But what is the word? وَدَّتْ, the feminine form, because it's referring to ta'ifa, a group of, which is a feminine word. So it uses the feminine verbal form of wadda, waddat, right? So they love that this occurs, right? So they want something to come about. So now, with those couple of verses in hand, we can start to put together some ideas to help us understand the differences in some of the things that I mentioned earlier. So first of all, let's look at some of the verses that calls Allah wadud. Well, it's actually only 2 verses. So the first verse is 1190. So we're going to go to chapter 11, verse 90. So in 1190, he says, وَاسْتَغْفِرُوا رَبَّكُمْ ثُمَّ تُوبُوا إِلَيْهِ, and seek forgiveness of your Lord and then repent to him. إِنَّ رَبِّي رَحِيمٌ وَدُودٌ. Truly, my Lord is merciful and wadud, loving. Rahimun wadud. Now, what's interesting to notice here is in the verse about relationships, what did he connect mawadda with? وَجَعَلَ بَيْنَكُمْ مَوَدَّةً وَرَحْمَةً. Right? He made between you and your relationships with your mates mawadda, certain type of love and affection, and rahmah, mercy. And here also he connects mercy with mawadda. Inna Rabbi Rahimun Wadud. That my Lord is merciful and loving. And the other place in the Qur'an that we find this is in chapter 80, verse 14. So chapter 80, verse 14, he says, I think I passed it up. Chapter 80, verse 14 is Surah Al-Buruj. There we go. So he says, وَهُوَ الْغَفُورُ الْوَدُودُ. وَهُوَ الْغَفُورُ الْوَدُودُ. And he is the forgiving, the loving. Al-Ghafur al-Wadud. So 2 times that he uses the word wadud, loving, for himself. 1 time is connected with rahmah, rahimun wadud, and 1 time is connected with maghfirah, or forgiveness, al-Ghafur al-Wadud. So combining that with the other observation that we made about the word wadda, which it has within it, it's the meaning of wanting something to come about, right? Perhaps the reason that Allah refers to himself as a noun or a name as Al-Wadud in connection to Rahim and in connection to Al-Ghafur, he's merciful and he's forgiving and he's loving, in the sense that he always wants good things to come about for us. He doesn't want bad things to come about for us. He wants mercy, compassion, and forgiveness. He's loving as a name, as a noun, in the sense that this is a established part of his qualities, his names and his qualities, that he wants. He has this love for us, that he wants good things to come about. He has the opposite of enmity and hostility and conflict with us. Such a beautiful meaning. But on the other hand, why is it that he uses variations of hubb, like yuhibbu, as a verb and not as a name like al-muhib? Perhaps because, let's go back to the meaning of the word hubb that we discovered from the Qur'an, that it's the opposite of qur, to be averse or repelled from something, or to find something disgusting, detestable, or something that you hate. So that means hubb, and Allah knows best, is something that has an attractive quality. It pulls you. So for example, when Allah says yuhibbu al-muttaqin, that means, and Allah knows best, people who have the characteristic of taqwa, right, are, Allah loves them in the sense of he's pulling, they are bringing Allah and his laws and principles into their lives and attracting those things into their lives. Because Allah stands for, and Allah knows best, a higher level of consciousness. Allah is the algorithm of everything. Allah is the intelligence behind everything. He is the representation, the intelligent representation of the laws and the principles that govern this universe. So when he says yuhibbu, then potentially part of that meaning is that we are able to draw and attract those laws and principles into our lives by applying the qualities that more coincide with the nature of those laws and principles, the nature of the laws and principles that he puts in his universe. And see, this reminds me of, like, for example, even in English, if we talk about a material, for example, just as an example, that can dissolve in water, for example, we would say it's hydrophilic. We would call that in English hydrophilic. What does that literally mean? That means it loves water. Now, that doesn't mean like it literally has emotions and it loves water like emotionally, but it's telling us that its nature coincides with the exact nature that's needed for it to dissolve in water, like salt, for example. Something that doesn't mix well with water, like oil, would be called hydrophobic, afraid of water. But it's not sitting there like, oh, I'm so scared of water. Its nature isn't such that it mixes with that. So hubb potentially is talking about an attractive quality where the natures of things bring them together in such a way that they connect. So Allahu, when Allah says, for example, yuhibbul muttaqin, and I'm just using that as an example, there's a bunch of different verses where he uses the word yuhibbu, right? Then potentially what he's saying is the nature of this higher consciousness. Those who have taqwa, their nature fits the nature of the higher consciousness that is Allah, and so therefore they are more connected with that. That's yuhibbu. But wadud, al-wadud, means he himself, this intelligence, right, itself wants good things to come about for you because that's connected with mercy and forgiveness. And see, this also lends more support or gives us some reasoning behind why is it that in a relationship, when Allah describes our relationships between our azwaj, our mates, he says he placed between us mawaddah, and he didn't say hubb. Well, a really interesting way to answer that question is based on chapter 4, verse 19. So chapter 4, verse 19 tells us, it's a long verse, it has a few things, but it gives us this advice about having this marital relationship. It says, وَعَاشِرُهُنَّ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ, specifically telling us about our wives, that we should interact with them in a way that's connected with ma'ruf, what's known socially in the socially appropriate way, or sometimes they translate it as in a reasonable way. Then he says, فَإِن كَرِهْتُمُهُنَّ, so use a variation of the word kur or karaha. فَإِن كَرِهْتُمُهُنَّ, if you dislike them or find something about them that you don't like or that you feel repelled from. Because what is this? What is this word? كَرِهْتُمُهُنَّ is the opposite of hubb, right? Then he says, فَعَسَى أَن تَكْرَهُ شَيْئًا وَيَجْعَلَ اللَّهُ فِيهِ خَيْرًا كَثِيرًا. Then it may be that you find karaha in something. You find something that your nature is not necessarily drawn to, but Allah puts in that thing a great deal of good. So he reminds us, see, this is really beautiful because karaha is the opposite of hubb. So that tells us that hubb is something that changes in a relationship. And anyone that's been in a relationship probably has experienced that. Like it goes up and down, this kind of love, where the love where you feel drawn to something, because sometimes you might get irritated with each other and you might not feel drawn to each other for that moment, right? We're not necessarily saying in general, but day to day, moment to moment, sometimes you might want to get away because you might be irritated with each other, right? So that actually shows us very beautifully why in the other verse he said وَجَعَلَ بَيْنَكُمْ مَوَدَّةً, not hubban, mawaddatan wa rahma, because mawaddah is the opposite of adawa, enmity or conflict. So even if you guys get irritated with each other and you don't always find that drawing in certain situations, that drawing quality to each other, you can still have mawaddah and rahma, compassion and mawaddah, because mawaddah consists of the opposite of having enmity or hostility, and as we saw from certain verses, wanting something to come about. And so because it's connected with rahma, I would say mawaddah in that verse is the type of love where you want good for that person. So you have compassion and mawaddah, where regardless of the fluctuating emotions that you might have in other places in your relationship, but you still always want good to come about for that person. And that coincides with another verse where he tells us, inna min azwajikum wa awladikum aduwwan lakum, that from your mates and your children are aduwwan lakum, are enemies for you. Now someone might say, what does that mean? How are they enemies for you? Well, we don't want to think of it too literally, right? If we think of it just as something, adu, an enemy, or adawa, as something that might at times go against or conflict with what we might see or what we might think or what we might feel. So it doesn't necessarily mean literally an enemy, first of all. But secondly, it uses the word min azwajikum, from them. It means not as a whole they're your enemy, but part of them. Min can mean a part of something. Min azwajikum, a part of them can conflict with you sometimes. So when you put the verses together, you see why it's so beautiful that he said, وَجَعَلَ بَيْنَكُمْ مَوَدَّةً وَرَحْمَةً, that he placed between you mawaddah and mercy, because that's what you really need to deal with all those fluctuating conflicts that you might have from day to day. You need that mawaddah, that desire for good to come about for a person, and rahmah, to have mercy. And also, when it comes to adawa, Allah told us in another verse how to deal with adawa in general. He said, idfa' billati hiya ahsan. He said, repel with that which is more beautiful. فَإِذَا الَّذِي بَيْنَكَ وَبَيْنَهُ عَدَاوَةٌ كَأَنَّهُ وَلِيٌّ حَمِيمٌ. He said, repel negativity with that which is more beautiful. For if you do so, the one who between you and that person there was some adawa, some enmity or hostility, will be as if they were a close friend. And that's in general. So if adawa is the opposite of mawaddah, and he placed between you and your mate mawaddah and rahmah, then even more so, this ayat applies to that. That if you find adawa in your relationship, right, in order to have mawaddah, you have to idfa' billati hiya ahsan. You have to repel the adawa with something that's more beautiful. So mawaddah is actually a very practical way of implementing love by your actions in a relationship that's not contingent upon your day-to-day fluctuations and irritations and irritabilities and all that type of stuff. So that's just a quick thought about what's the difference between hubb and mawaddah, and Allah knows best. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.